You feel the heat of the sun pounding down on your neck, the air thick with dust, clinging to your skin, your clothes, as the smell of burning oil and diesel fills your lungs. A deep rumbling, heavy trucks, their engines growling like a predator ready to strike, moves through the harsh desert landscape. You see the dust trail rising behind them, swallowing the horizon. The world is heavy, the silence oppressive, and beneath it, the sound of a clock ticking. Slow, deliberate, but unyielding. The stage is set, but you don't know it yet. There is no warning. No one could have predicted it. You can hear a distant echo of a gunshot in the air. Then silence again. Only the whisper of the wind. The earth trembles. A sudden shift beneath your feet. Your heart races as the sound grows louder. A fast, mechanical hum, engines roar across the land, as forces far beyond your control begin to march toward an unstoppable destiny. You are a witness to something monumental, something terrifying that will alter the course of history. The air is so thick with anticipation, you can almost taste it, heart metallic. It burns the back of your throat. Your hands tremble, but you can't look away. The world has shifted. You don't know why, but deep down, you feel it. This moment is something more than a whisper. It's a declaration, something dark. A shadow creeping in, inching closer with every second. And then, in the distance, the glint of military vehicles marching toward an unknown conflict. The sky, so vast and infinite, now seems like a canvas of chaos, swirling with red and orange, as if painted by the flames of war. The desert, once an indifferent and barren land, is now the battleground for something far more sinister. But you don't yet know who stands behind this invasion. You don't yet know the man who has set this entire thing into motion. You don't know the dictator, the tyrant, whose ambitions are about to engulf the entire region, whose grip on power will be felt across the globe. His name, Saddam Hussein. CrimeCoreX presents a deep dive into one of the most defining military conflicts of the 20th century, America's decisive role in crushing Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War. The Middle East, a region rich in oil, its sands drenched in centuries of bloodshed and ambition. A place where global superpowers have long fought for dominance, where the stakes have always been high. And in 1990, that world teetered on the edge of catastrophe. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was the moment the world could no longer look away. Before we reveal how the world teetered on the edge of catastrophe, imagine missing the moment this powder keg exploded. Smash that like button now. The story begins long before the tanks rolled across the Kuwaiti border. It begins in the small, dusty streets of Tikrit, Iraq, where a young boy learned that in a world of chaos, power was the only thing that mattered. A boy who watched, as many do, from the shadows of a family torn apart by conflict. The poverty, the violence, the constant struggle for survival, these would become the building blocks of a man who would grow into a dictator feared across the globe. Saddam Hussein, his name would soon strike terror in the hearts of many. But before he wore the title of president like a crown, he was a young man, driven by a singular, burning desire to control, to dominate, to rule with an iron fist. He rose from humble beginnings, his early life steeped in brutality and hardship. A nephew of an influential family member, he was born to a father who was absent and a mother who struggled to raise him. But it was Saddam's own grit, his hunger for power that would define his future. By the time he had maneuvered his way into the upper echelons of Iraq's political machinery, Saddam was no longer just another figure in the crowd. He was a force. His rise to power came not through diplomacy or kindness, but through cunning and sheer brutality. He forged alliances with those who could help him, often eliminating rivals along the way. He wasn't interested in political niceties. He was interested in one thing: total domination. And then came the war, the Iran-Iraq War, a bloody, 8-year conflict that would cost Iraq billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives. Yet it would cement Saddam's position. The world would look at him and see a leader, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything to hold on to power. The war, with its poison gas and trench warfare, devastated both nations, leaving them broken physically, economically, spiritually. But Saddam, he emerged from it battered but unbowed, more determined than ever to establish his reign as a brutal dictator. In the wreckage of the war, Saddam found his way. His grip on power tightened as Iraq's economy continued to crumble. The man who had once been an idealist, dreaming of a unified Arab world, now focused on his own survival. With oil riches and a powerful military, he was prepared to solidify his position. And that desire to stay at the top would set the stage for his next move. A bold, reckless gamble that would change the world forever. In the aftermath of war, there is only silence, an eerie, crushing quiet that settles into the heart of a nation. The Iran-Iraq War had torn apart everything in its path. The devastation wasn't just in the thousands of lives lost, the acres of land scarred by bombs, or the fields burned by poison gas. It was in the very soul of Iraq. The coffers, once brimming with oil wealth, had emptied, drained by the insatiable cost of war. What remained were debts, heavy, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. Saddam, once a figurehead of unyielding power, now stood before the wreckage of his empire. His hands shook as he clutched the papers, promises from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, written in black ink, binding him to repayment. But the war had crippled Iraq. Iraq's oil revenues, which had once been a lifeline, now felt like a distant memory. Every oil barrel that could have been sold was now a marker of failure, a reminder of debts that he could not afford to pay. His plea was desperate. He called on the nations that had once supported Iraq during the long struggle against Iran. He looked to Kuwait, who had been a critical ally, but who had also seen its own share of prosperity in those dark years. Yet the world had changed. The fragile alliances forged in the fires of war were now brittle, shattering under the weight of Saddam's request for forgiveness. Saddam's appeal was met with cold refusal. Kuwait, along with Saudi Arabia, stood firm in its rejection. The reasons were not new: economic interests, pride, and an unwavering stance against what many saw as Iraq's growing instability. But the refusal cut deeper than any battle wound. This wasn't just financial, this was personal. Saddam's ambition had been thwarted by a small, oil-rich nation that refused to bend to his will. In his eyes, Kuwait's oil production had become a knife in Iraq's back. While Saddam struggled to rebuild, Kuwait continued to pump oil with impunity, flooding the market and lowering prices. To Iraq, it felt like economic sabotage, an underhanded strike when they were already on their knees. The gulf between the two nations widened, each moment filled with an air of impending conflict. And as the months dragged on, the tension grew unbearable. Saddam's mind churned with dark thoughts, his frustration turning into something more dangerous. His rage twisted into a plan, a decision that would seal the fate of not just his own nation, but the entire region. His troops, trained, battle-hardened from the long years of the Iran-Iraq War, were already on the move. They began to silently gather at the Kuwaiti border, like wolves circling their prey. As the first lines of military vehicles rolled toward Kuwait, the world watched. The sounds of marching boots and the hum of military engines stirred something deep in the collective global conscience. There was a storm coming, a storm the world could no longer ignore. The question is, when the first signals appeared, when the signs of aggression emerged on the horizon, what if the world had listened? What if the whispers of impending danger had been enough to stop this nightmare before it even started? The clocks ticked away the seconds, but for many, it was already too late. History would soon reveal the devastating consequences. As Saddam's troops massed on the border, the world held its breath. But what if you missed the warning signs? Drop your "what would you have done" below. Don't be the one silent while history marches. The tension between Iraq and Kuwait had long been simmering beneath the surface, like a fire that threatens to ignite at any moment. Saddam Hussein, though cloaked in the confidence of a man who had crushed internal opposition, felt a gnawing sense of injustice, a belief that had taken root long ago. To him, Kuwait was more than just a neighbor. It was a part of Iraq, a vital extension of his nation's history and legacy. In his mind, it was the 19th province, a claim born from the scars of Ottoman rule, from borders drawn by foreign hands. In the days before the invasion, Saddam's thoughts had turned inward. He spoke of Kuwait as if it were a lost child, a part of his birthright that had been wrenched away in the chaos of history. Yet, his demands, steeped in this deep-seated conviction, only pushed the world further away. The quiet words he sent to Kuwait were met with defiance, the silent response of a nation that knew how to stand firm, even in the face of a much larger enemy. Kuwait's leadership, unwavering and resolute, refused to bend to Saddam's will. For them, surrendering to his demands was as unthinkable as surrendering their sovereignty. But the rejection was not a simple diplomatic standoff. It became a slow burn, a quiet, bitter fury that simmered in Saddam's chest, threatening to boil over. He couldn't let go of the idea. The sight of Kuwait, flourishing with its wealth and resources, felt like an affront, and as the days passed, the thought of humiliation began to cloud his mind. In Saddam's world, power was everything. It was not just about money or territory, it was about domination. And here, on the edge of the Persian Gulf, Kuwait stood as a reminder of his impotence. A small, rich nation, unwavering in its stance, mocking his authority. The pressure built within him until, finally, it reached a breaking point. His troops, ever ready for a confrontation, began to gather on the southern border. Drawn by the invisible hand of destiny, thousands of soldiers, armored tanks, and military vehicles began their march toward the border with Kuwait. Each passing hour brought them closer to the precipice, their engines echoing in the distance like a rumbling storm. The world, still focused on the diplomatic efforts to calm the rising storm, failed to notice the subtle shift. The troop deployments were ignored, written off as posturing, a bluff that would dissolve as it always had before. But this time, the stakes were different. This time, Saddam was no longer playing a game of politics. He was making a statement, a declaration of power. As the first units of Iraqi soldiers crossed the border, the silence was broken. The movement of forces was not immediate chaos. It was deliberate, calculated. There was no rush, no wild charge. Instead, there was a cold, methodical approach, as though Saddam was certain of the outcome, already picturing Kuwait as an extension of his rule. For the Kuwaiti forces, there was no time to react. Their army, dwarfed by the might of the Iraqi military, stood no chance. Saddam's forces moved with terrifying precision, sweeping across the border like a storm that could not be stopped. The initial resistance was weak and scattered, unable to hold back the momentum of the invasion. The war, it seemed, had already been decided. In the world beyond the borders of Kuwait, the reaction was one of shock and disbelief. The international community, watching from a distance, failed to recognize the storm until it was upon them. The invasion was swift, like a sudden wave crashing against a fragile shoreline. No warning, no time to prepare. But the question that lingered was not why Saddam acted, but why the world had allowed it to get this far. Why had the signs been ignored? Why had the warnings been so easily brushed aside? As Saddam's troops surged forward, the world held its breath, knowing that the consequences would not be contained by Kuwait's borders. The flames of conflict were spreading, and there was no turning back. In the quiet of his office, Saddam sat before the map, his fingers grazing the lines that divided Iraq from Kuwait. The map was not just a set of boundaries. It was a reflection of what he saw as an unjust division, a scar across his nation's pride. Kuwait, in his eyes, had always belonged to Iraq. The ink of history was already written in his mind, each line a reminder of the lands taken from Iraq. His military advisors stood rigidly at attention, their gazes fixed ahead, but Saddam's thoughts were distant, far from the men in the room. His eyes remained locked on the future, on a future that in his mind would affirm his rightful place as master of the region. The decision that would set the course for everything had already taken root. Every failed ambition, every slight from the world powers who had denied him. This was the moment that would redeem it all. The weight of history pressed down on his shoulders. It wasn't just about oil, about territory. It was about legacy. This would define everything, a chance to rewrite the narrative he had crafted for so long. The decision was not made lightly, nor without internal conflict, but in the end, the thirst for power drowned any hesitation. The orders were given. On August 20, 1990, the storm broke, tanks roared to life, their engines vibrating through the stillness of the desert. The ground trembled beneath their weight as they rumbled forward, an unstoppable force moving across the earth. The first waves of the invasion crashed into Kuwait like an overwhelming tide. The sound of gunfire was quickly swallowed by the rumble of Iraqi tanks, their tracks cutting through the dry desert sands, indifferent to the weak resistance they encountered. Kuwait had never stood a chance. Its military, small, unprepared, was swept aside in a matter of hours. Kuwait, once a prosperous, independent nation, was now swallowed whole. The world, as the news spread, reeled from the shock. The city had fallen, not through diplomacy, not through political maneuvering, but through raw, unforgiving force. But the speed of the invasion wasn't the most unsettling part. It was the coldness, the calculated precision with which it was executed. Saddam wasn't simply waging war. He was making a statement, a move, a direct assertion of dominance. He had planned every detail. The sweep of his forces wasn't driven by desperation, but by intent. There was no panic, no hesitation, only the deliberate march of power. As the world watched in shock, the full scope of the invasion began to unfold. Leaders in Washington, London, Riyadh, each of them caught in disbelief, struggled to make sense of the unfolding events. No one had expected this. The United Nations was quickly convened, but their words were drowned out by the weight of the tanks moving across the desert. In their haste to condemn, they had been too slow to act. Saddam's actions were not just a breach of sovereignty. They were an assertion of control over the lifeblood of the global economy. By seizing Kuwait, Saddam was not merely expanding Iraq's borders. He was taking command of a region that was crucial to the world's oil supply. This wasn't an isolated conflict. It was a declaration of dominance, an opening salvo that would shift the geopolitical balance. In Baghdad, Saddam's face remained impassive, the stone mask of a leader who had seen such battles before. He watched the news, but it was as if he had already seen the outcome. He had calculated every move, every piece on the chessboard. His troops were already entrenched in Kuwait, and there was no turning back. The shockwaves of his decision rippled outward, but he was beyond caring now. The game had begun. The world, though stunned, had no choice but to react. The first waves of retaliatory measures were already in motion. And as they did, the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just about Kuwait. It was about an entire region. And soon, the world itself. This invasion would plunge the Middle East, and the entire globe, into a conflict none could yet fully comprehend. Saddam had already made his move. The global clock had begun ticking, each second counting down to the inevitable escalation. The Gulf War had started, and the ripple effects would be felt for years to come. The moment Saddam's forces crossed into Kuwait, the world seemed to hold its breath. The night was thick with the silence of uncertainty. Yet in Washington, D.C., behind the closed doors of the White House, the air crackled with a different tension. President George H.W. Bush stood before his advisors, his face shadowed by the weight of a decision that was already in motion. From the moment the invasion began, the United States was thrust into a new reality. America's response to this unprovoked act of aggression would define its role on the world stage for decades to come. In the halls of power, there was little room for hesitation. The stakes were too high, the consequences too grave. Saddam had not only crossed a border, he had shattered the fragile balance of power in the Middle East. His swift takeover of Kuwait was an affront to the international order. America, the self-declared protector of peace and freedom, could not let this stand. Bush's initial response was measured, restrained. He had to think carefully. The wheels of diplomacy turned slowly, and at first the United States focused on rallying its allies, bringing them into the fold. In the coming days, it became clear that a direct military confrontation was inevitable. America's military might was formidable, but there were risks. Risks that would reverberate beyond the borders of Kuwait. The oil fields of the Middle East were not just economic lifelines. They were the lifeblood of global power. With the possibility of Saddam controlling them, the consequences of inaction were far worse than any military strike. Saddam's miscalculation was perhaps his greatest mistake. In his mind, the United States would not dare to intervene. He had been emboldened by past diplomatic encounters, especially a meeting with U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, just days before the invasion. In that conversation, Glaspie had subtly conveyed the US's disinterest in the internal disputes between Iraq and Kuwait. Saddam had misread the signals. He believed that the US would not sacrifice its interest over a small oil-rich nation like Kuwait. How could they? America had never shown any serious intent to engage in Middle Eastern conflicts beyond its borders. His logic was simple. If the US had no strategic reason to care about Kuwait, why would it risk its soldiers' lives over it? But as Saddam's forces dug deeper into Kuwait, the mistake became all too apparent. America and the rest of the world was watching. Bush, alongside his military and diplomatic advisors, understood the implications of this conflict. If Iraq's control of Kuwait was left unchecked, Saddam could become an even greater regional threat, possibly even a global one. The domino effect was undeniable. A dictator with a stronghold on the world's most valuable oil reserves could reshape the balance of power in the region and beyond. With an air of cold determination, President Bush immediately began formulating a plan to not only eject Iraq from Kuwait, but to remove Saddam from power. But this would require more than just the US acting alone. The United States knew that to stop Saddam's advance, it needed a coalition of forces, an international show of unity that would pressure Saddam from all sides. Diplomacy shifted into high gear. The world's superpower reached out to its allies, but also to the Arab states, who had a vested interest in the outcome. The formation of the coalition was a delicate dance. Each nation was weighing the costs and benefits of taking action. Some, like the United Kingdom, were eager to lend their support. But others, like Saudi Arabia, feared the repercussions of defying Saddam. Yet, in the face of his aggression, they had little choice. The US managed to persuade not only NATO members, but also other Arab states, including Egypt and Syria, that this invasion was not just Iraq's war. It was a threat to the stability of the entire Middle East. Even the Soviet Union, under Mikhail Gorbachev, stood aside, neither supporting nor opposing the military action. This was a new era, and even the Cold War superpowers had to adapt to the new world order, where the US would take the lead. The coalition came together under the banner of the United Nations, with Resolution 6078 offering Iraq a final deadline to withdraw from Kuwait. But Saddam, unyielding and arrogant, refused to back down. By January 15, 1991, the deadline passed without compliance, and the world prepared for war. The US had marshaled its forces, soldiers, tanks, aircraft, ready to strike with unprecedented force. This was no longer a diplomatic standoff. The world had reached a breaking point. And so, in the weeks following the deadline, as the first waves of American jets ascended into the darkened skies above the Persian Gulf, a new chapter in the Gulf War began. The military operation, now known as Desert Storm, would not just be a fight for Kuwait. It would be a fight for the future of the Middle East and the balance of power in the world. The world held its breath. The military might of the coalition, led by the US, was about to unleash a devastating assault. Saddam, who had once believed that his military prowess and regional influence would shield him from the wrath of the world's most powerful nation, now found himself at the center of an overwhelming force. The gambit had failed, and there would be no retreat. The air is thick with tension. The sun hangs low over the vast, barren desert, casting long, sharp shadows that stretch out into infinity. The silence of the land is broken only by the distant rumble of military engines. These aren't the usual sounds of a desert at peace. These are the sounds of an invasion. The world's most powerful military machine is moving across the sand. The first wave of US troops has arrived in Saudi Arabia. At first, it's a trickle, small groups of soldiers, vehicles, and planes arriving on makeshift runways. But as the hours pass, the trickle becomes a flood. The desert, once desolate and untouched, is soon alive with the mechanical hum of military precision. 500,000 troops, 500,000 soldiers, vehicles, aircraft are mobilizing, assembling in the blistering heat, preparing for a war that will come to define a generation. They move with purpose, knowing that every second spent waiting is a second lost. The air is thick with sweat and dust. The men and women in uniform are weary, but determined. They understand the stakes, even if the world is still trying to comprehend the magnitude of what's unfolding. Moving into formation, The heavy thrum of the motors beneath them vibrates through the earth, while the sand dances around their boots. In that moment, they feel the heavy pull of destiny, closing in around them. From the other side, Saddam Hussein watches. There's no fear in his eyes, just a hardened resolve. He has been here before, or at least he believes he has. He has seen the political posturing, the heavy rhetoric of international diplomacy. He has heard the talk of war, the threats, the sanctions. But in his mind, this is just more of the same. Another bluff. He has survived sanctions before. He has navigated the labyrinth of international diplomacy with the skill of a seasoned player. In his eyes, America is far from willing to engage in another Middle Eastern conflict. The Gulf War, he believes, is a far-off mirage, nothing more than a paper tiger. Saddam underestimates the resolve of the United States. He sees only the economic and political consequences, not the larger play at hand, the power dynamics at work behind the scenes, the rhetoric of Bush and the international coalition. He assumes it's all theater. After all, no one in the West would risk another military quagmire in the heart of the Middle East. No one would send soldiers to fight over a small nation like Kuwait. But as the days pass, the reality begins to settle in. The air fills with the hum of military jets overhead, the growl of military vehicles rumbling across the desert floor. Each passing hour makes the presence of the US forces undeniable. Saddam, ever the confident strategist, begins to feel the first traces of doubt, lingering but elusive, like a storm cloud on the horizon. But even then, he refuses to fully accept the gravity of the situation. His forces are strong. He is in control. At the same time, global diplomacy continues to churn. The United Nations moves with its signature slowness, but the pressure on Saddam grows. Sanctions, condemned actions, a growing list of international condemnations. It is becoming clear that Saddam has alienated the very world that once turned a blind eye to his cruelties. The UN pushes for a resolution, demanding his withdrawal from Kuwait. Diplomatic channels are flooded with urgency, but Saddam remains defiant, dismissive of the diplomatic assault. In his mind, these are just words, empty threats. Yet the buildup is undeniable. The machinery of war is being constructed before his eyes, and the coalition surrounding the US is expanding. What began as a simple act of aggression against a small nation has now evolved into a global crisis. The nations of the world, each with their own agendas and interests, are now united by one goal: the ousting of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. The line has been drawn in the sand. The troops, once scattered across Saudi Arabia, are beginning to take their final positions. From the air, the skies hum with the sound of jets ready to strike. From the ground, soldiers prepare, every detail meticulously calculated, every move synchronized with military precision. The tension, the sense of impending doom, hangs heavy in the air, thick with the smell of oil and sand. It is the calm before the storm, the last few moments of preparation before the thunder of war shatters the stillness. Right now, 500,000 troops mobilize in the desert. Hit that notification bell or be caught off guard when missiles fly. It begins without warning, like a sudden clap of thunder in a storm that has long been brewing. The quiet desert air, once still and heavy with tension, is ripped apart by the roar of fighter jets as they cut through the sky. The engines scream with power, cutting through the horizon like steel blades. On the ground, men and women brace for what they know is coming. The stillness broken by the rapid pulse of warfare. The air war has begun. At the heart of this sudden fury is an overwhelming technological might, an invisible precision that shifts the very rules of combat. The coalition's aircraft, equipped with state-of-the-art weaponry, soar high above the desolate terrain of Iraq and Kuwait. The world, once confined to older modes of warfare, now witnesses the power of modern technology. Bombs fall with uncanny accuracy, precision-guided missiles seeking their target with surgical precision. The skies, once empty and serene, are now filled with destruction. The thunderous sound of jets reverberating in the air like the echo of an ancient battle cry. Saddam's military, although formidable on the ground, is caught off guard. For all the might of his tanks and soldiers, the skies are not his to command. His forces, unprepared for the overwhelming air assault, scramble to respond. They fire missiles into the air, hoping to hit something, anything. But the coalition forces are already far beyond their reach. Each missile is like a desperate gasp, an attempt to fight back against a force that can see them, but they cannot see. But Saddam's desperation isn't limited to the air. As his control over the ground begins to slip away, he turns to his final resort, scorched earth tactics. The desert sky turns dark as flames leap from the oil fields of Kuwait, casting an orange glow across the night, a burning reminder of Iraq's rage. The black smoke rises like a veil, blanketing the land, choking the very life from the earth below. His hope is simple: to slow the coalition, to drown their advance in smoke and fire, to make the battlefield a place where no one can see clearly. The sight is haunting, as if the earth itself is waging war. Saddam believes, perhaps rightly, that the destruction of Kuwait's oil reserves will not only hurt the economy of the West, but slow the coalition's ruse. He is wrong. Instead, the flames become a symbol of his failure, a feudal, burning gesture of defiance against a military machine that is far superior. As the fire spreads, so too does the realization that he is fighting a losing battle. The real turning point, though, comes in the skies. The coalition forces, led by the United States, unleash their arsenal with cold precision. Stealth bombers, unseen by the Iraqi air defenses, slip past radar systems, unseen and unheard, until the bombs drop. Each strike is measured, methodical, a reminder that this is no longer a war of brute force, but one of calculated, almost mechanical execution. Iraqi air defenses are decimated, one by one, as the relentless onslaught overwhelms their outdated technology. The bombs hit with an almost eerie accuracy, striking strategic military targets with devastating effect. The illusion of Iraqi superiority crumbles with every explosion. Tanks, artillery, and command centers are obliterated in moments, leaving only twisted metal and the echoes of what once was. The speed at which Saddam's military begins to break under the relentless assault is almost shocking. What seemed like an immovable force has been reduced to rubble, each bombing run driving the Iraqi defenses deeper into chaos. And all the while, Saddam watches, his hands clenched, his eyes burning with fury and disbelief. He has underestimated the technological prowess of the coalition, and with each passing hour, the gap between his forces and the overwhelming might of the West grows wider. He had counted on his soldiers, his tanks, his oil. But in the face of precision-guided missiles and satellite surveillance, none of it matters. The coalition's technological superiority has transformed the battlefield into a place where his army, however vast, cannot escape the certainty of defeat. The air war is relentless. Every moment, every second, the skies are filled with death. But it is not chaos. It is calculated, deliberate, each move a piece of the puzzle being placed with perfect precision. For the men and women in the coalition forces, it is not about destruction for the sake of destruction. It is about efficiency, the swift execution of a plan that has been months in the making. The psychological toll on the Iraqi forces is immense. Not only are they physically battered, but the very nature of the conflict, the sheer technological superiority of their opponents, erodes their morale, shattering any hopes they had left. Then so, the world watches, helplessly captivated by a conflict that seems to unfold with brutal inevitability. The fire in Kuwait's oil fields becomes a symbol of Saddam's fading power. The skies, once calm and serene, now blaze with the fury of war. And in the hearts of those who have stood against the storm, there is only one question: how long can this go on? It begins with the hum of engines, low at first, growing steadily louder. The earth trembles beneath the weight of the tanks as they roll across the desert, a slow and deliberate force cutting through the silence of the war-torn landscape. This is no longer just an air campaign. This is the moment when the ground forces, hardened and resolute, descend on their prey. The precision of airstrikes has softened the defenses. Now it's time to finish the job. On February 24, 1991, the world watched as the ground offensive of Operation Desert Storm began. The culmination of weeks of relentless bombing. The coalition forces, spearheaded by American soldiers, moved with brutal efficiency. They crossed the Kuwaiti border, their advance swift and decisive. It was as if the earth itself had been carved open by the wheels of war, with every inch gaining them ground. every moment a step closer to liberation. Iraq's military, now broken and battered from the unrelenting aerial assault, was in no position to mount any effective resistance. Their tanks and artillery, once formidable, now lay scattered across the desert, like abandoned relics of a lost cause. The men who had once held these machines, now reduced to shadows of their former selves, were already fleeing, desperate to escape the oncoming storm. It was chaos, but it was chaos of a different kind, a disordered retreat, where no plan, no order could save them. And then came the highway of death, a stretch of road that would forever be etched in the memories of those who witnessed it. A highway that stretched across the desert, a lifeline for the retreating Iraqi forces, now turned into a death trap. Thousands of soldiers, panicked and disoriented, scrambled for their lives, unaware that the coalition forces had them cornered. They were trapped. There was nowhere to run. The road, once an escape route, had become a killing field. It was as if the sky itself descended upon them, with bombs raining down like a wrathful storm. Coalition aircraft, silent in the sky, dropped their payloads with the precision that had defined this entire war. Each explosion was a punctuation, a final note in a deadly symphony. The Iraqi soldiers, caught in their futile flight, had nowhere to go. There was no escape. Tanks, trucks, and bodies piled up in twisted heaps along the highway. The desert, once indifferent, was now stained with the blood of those who had hoped for an easy retreat. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. For the men in the coalition forces, it was a victory, but one tempered by the horror of what they had just witnessed. The sheer brutality of it, the massacre of an entire retreating army, left its mark. It was decisive, yes, but it was also haunting. War was never meant to be this swift, this final, a moment of destruction that felt more like an erasure than a victory. In the span of hours, Iraq's military was crumbling. What had once seemed like a monolith, an unstoppable force in the region, now lay in tatters. The coalition forces, efficient and relentless, pushed deeper into Kuwait. The retreat of Saddam's army was not just a flight from battle, it was the collapse of a regime. The streets of Kuwait, once under occupation, now stood ready to be liberated. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was over. The Iraqi forces, exhausted and broken, were retreating into the night, their pride shattered. The once feared military machine that Saddam had built with such determination was now in disarray. What had begun as a reckless gamble by a dictator had ended in total defeat. The world, watching from a distance, was left stunned by the speed and decisiveness of the victory. Kuwait was free. But the question that lingered, like a shadow over the battlefield, was simple. What had just happened? In just 100 hours, the course of the war had shifted. In less than 4 days, the world had witnessed the collapse of one of the most powerful armies in the region. Saddam's dreams of conquest, of regional domination, were no more. His forces lay in ruin, scattered across the desert like remnants of a forgotten era. The story was now clear. The power of modern warfare, the technology, the speed, and the precision, it had rewritten the rules of combat. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. A new era had begun, where the old rules no longer applied. The world had just witnessed what it meant to fight with an overwhelming advantage, to strike with force that was unimaginable to those caught in the storm. What if you blinked and missed the 100 hours that rewrote warfare? Subscribe now, because not witnessing victories this decisive, that's a haunting regret. The sound of battle fades, replaced by the eerie silence of aftermath. The skies, once filled with the roar of jet engines and the deafening crack of explosions, are now still on March 3, 1991. After just 100 hours of ground combat, a ceasefire is declared. The decision is not born of mutual agreement or diplomatic resolution. It is a necessity. The military might of the coalition has overwhelmed Iraq's forces with a swiftness that defies belief. The ground assault, once a terrifying possibility, has ended in a matter of days, leaving in its wake not only the remnants of Iraq's military, but the shattered image of Saddam Hussein's regime. In Baghdad, Saddam's face, once a symbol of power, is now a mask of humiliation. His soldiers, the proud army he had led with iron will, have been crushed. The dream of regional dominance is dead. buried beneath the weight of coalition tanks in the dust of the desert. The very foundation of his rule has crumbled. Yet, in the streets of Baghdad, the streets of a dictator's capital, there is no jubilation. The war is over, but the cost is too great to ignore. Saddam, though defeated on the battlefield, is not immediately toppled from power. His regime, though damaged, is not destroyed. The world watches as he clings to his position, his grip weakened, but still present. The image of a man once feared is now reduced to one of desperation. His public image, once untouchable, lies in tatters. The people who once saw him as a god, a force of nature, now watch him stumble, his authority shattered by a war he could not win. Yet, even in defeat, Saddam remains defiant. There is no surrender, no apology for his actions. His belief in his right to rule is unshaken. Even as the world turns its gaze away from his faltering regime, the walls around him may have cracked, but they have not yet fallen. He licks his wounds, retreats into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. In the rubble of war, the world is left to wonder, how could a man who had seemed so invincible be so quickly undone? The defeat was swift, overwhelming, and undeniably humiliating. But Saddam, ever the survivor, would learn nothing from it. His loss on the battlefield was not the end of his reign. It was merely the beginning of the next phase in his dark, twisted pursuit of power. Iraq, crushed and vulnerable, remains in his hands. For the people who live under his rule, the nightmare is not over. The war is won, but the cycle of oppression, of fear, of war itself, has only just begun. Saddam's humbling defeat will not end his reign. Instead, it will set the stage for future conflicts, for wars that will change the face of the Middle East once again. The echoes of the Gulf War will reverberate long after the ceasefire, a constant reminder of the futility of Saddam's ambition and the lasting consequences of his failure. The world may have been stunned by his defeat, but the true cost of this war, the loss of life, the devastation of nations, will be felt for years to come. Saddam's downfall was swift, but the ripple effect of his actions will haunt the world far longer than any battlefield victory ever could. The ceasefire has been declared, but the war is far from over. While the ground assault has ceased and the bombs have stopped falling, the true consequences of the conflict are just beginning to unfold. Saddam Hussein, though beaten on the battlefield, is far from defeated. The streets of Iraq, still stained with the echoes of war, tremble under the weight of oppression. As soon as the last coalition forces begin to withdraw, a new wave of dissent rises from within the very heart of the nation. The Kurds in the north, long oppressed and broken by Saddam's regime, seize the moment of Iraq's military collapse to seek freedom, to demand their right to exist without the shadow of a tyrant looming over them. The Shia, too, rise from their subjugation in the south, emboldened by the perceived weakness of Saddam's power. The blood of martyrs stains the earth as they pour into the streets, their voices hoarse with rage and grief. But their cries for freedom are met, not with sympathy, but with the brutal force of a dictator who has not forgotten how to crush opposition. Saddam, now more dangerous than ever, turns his wrath upon his own people. The tanks that once moved toward Kuwait now circle the cities of Iraq, ready to stamp out any hint of rebellion. The air is filled with the stench of gunpowder and burning flesh, the bitter sound of bullets slicing through the silence of hope. The brutality is unimaginable. Thousands of men, women, and children are slaughtered in the streets, their blood seeping into the desert sand. The Kurdish towns in the north are razed, their inhabitants left to rot in the wake of Saddam's punishment. In the south, the Shia uprisings are crushed with the efficiency of a regime that has learned the cost of mercy. This is not the action of a leader who has learned from his mistakes. It is the action of a tyrant who, though humiliated, still believes in his absolute right to rule. And as the internal bloodshed rages, the world watches from a distance, helpless. The United Nations, which had helped pave the way for the coalition's intervention, has now turned its gaze on Iraq once more. The sanctions that were imposed after the war, meant to punish Saddam for his aggression, slowly tighten around the throat of Iraq's civilian population. The infrastructure, already shattered by years of war, begins to crumble even further. The people, already on the brink of starvation, are caught in a web of international diplomacy and economic collapse. that they did not create. Despite the sanctions, despite the uprisings, Saddam remains at the helm. He consolidates his power not with diplomacy or peace, but with fear. His grip on Iraq tightens, his iron fist unyielding, even as the world looks on in disgust. His regime, though weakened, survives. His image, tarnished by defeat, is remade into something more terrifying, an indomitable will, a man who will stop at nothing to retain control. Saddam's ability to maintain power in the wake of such destruction is in itself a testament to the darkest parts of his nature. The world, exhausted by the conflict and paralyzed by political maneuvering, cannot stop him. As Iraq's streets fill with the ghosts of the fallen, Saddam stands alone in his palace, untouchable, preparing for the next chapter of his reign. The Gulf War is over, Kuwait has been liberated, Iraq's forces have been shattered, and the world has seen a new face of warfare, quick, precise, overwhelming. The US military, with its unmatched technological superiority, has emerged as the undisputed force in the region. Yet the cost of this victory is immeasurable. The Middle East is left in tatters, its geopolitical landscape forever altered. The war has reshaped the region, drawing the lines of conflict in new, unpredictable ways. The Gulf War has solidified US dominance in the region, but it has also left behind a legacy of destruction that will not fade easily. Saddam Hussein, though defeated in battle, is far from gone. His presence looms large over Iraq, and his actions in the aftermath of the war will set the stage for the next major conflict. A conflict that will take the world to the brink once again. The Gulf War, in its final analysis, is not just a story of military conquest, it is the story of power, survival, and the limits of global influence. It is the story of a dictator who, despite being crushed on the battlefield, would rise again, more dangerous and defiant than ever. Saddam Hussein, with his brutal grip on Iraq, would remain a central figure in global geopolitics, casting a shadow over the world for years to come. His defeat did not end his rule, it only delayed the inevitable. And so, the world watches. The fires of conflict that were stoked in 1990 have not been fully extinguished. As the dust settles from the Gulf War, the question remains, what comes next?
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Gulf War, if uncovering truths about wars that shaped our world matters to you, prove it.
Like this to honor the fallen, share so others don't ignore history, and subscribe to CrimeCoreX. Letting channels like ours fade, that's how history repeats.